The Supreme Court makes the most awful rulings, Harry, but they do also recognize that Trump is a complete madman. So there's this tension between them wanting to just be the most horrible right-wing court imaginable, but also recognizing, whoa, but if we go just too far there, he's literally going to destroy the entire country. So what you get is a bunch of made-up rules that literally is not based on precedent. It makes no sense at all, but they just decree it. And the best example of that was the ruling they made this past week, where they basically gave Donald Trump a blank check or full permission to what we always thought would be unlawful, to fire any chairperson or committee person on these independent agencies. And so there was a lawsuit that was filed by two individuals. One was Gwen Wilcox, who was from the National Labor Relations Board. The other is Kathy Harris from the Merit Systems Protection Board. We always viewed that if you wanted to fire people like that, it's got to be for cause, not just for any reason. Trump fired them just because, not for cause, without cause, just getting rid of them. And the Supreme Court basically ruled in the shadow docket, you can do that, you can do that. But then they had to confront another issue. Well, if you can do that, then aren't you giving Donald Trump permission to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve? Like, that's the natural, logical step. There's really nothing different between the way the Federal Reserve is set up and, say, the National Labor Relations Board or the Merit Systems Protections Board. And when you read a case like Humphrey's Executor, which was the law of the land for decades and decades, you would read that as seeming to have the same types of protections for the NLRB and the Merit Protections Board as you would for the Federal Reserve. I don't think anyone would be like, oh, the Federal Reserve is so different. But that's what the Supreme Court ruled. Then you go, well, why did they rule that way? It's because if there was somebody else in office other than Donald Trump, they probably would have found that you could fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But they realized that literally Donald Trump wants to destroy the United States of America. So they make this bizarre compromise in their mind. Let me be clear when I say they. The right-wing Supreme Court justices, the liberal justices hated this ruling, wrote an excoriating dissent. What the hell are you doing here? That makes no sense at all. And you're going to now allow Trump to fire all these other independent agencies. But you go and you read this, Harry, and it's like, respondents, Gwen Wilcox, NLRB, Kathy Harris, Merit System Boards, they contend that the arguments in this case necessarily implicate the constitutionality of for-cause removal protections for members of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors or other members of the Federal Open Market Committee. We disagree. The Federal Reserve is uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. Where have we seen that language before? Distinct historical tradition. That's when they just want to make shit up. They say distinct historical tradition, and that's all throughout their jurisprudence now. Second Amendment, this, that. Let's take a look at the distinct historical tradition, and then they go back and divine the way they view history was and go, you can have this weapon, but you can't have that weapon. And it's like, where are you even basing this on? Distinct historical tradition. They didn't have semi-automatic weapons and when the Constitution was drafted. You're just making shit up. And they are, and it's dangerous. And Harry Littman, I want to get your perspective. You've clerked two Supreme Court justices. One wasn't good enough. You had to do two just to show off. I'm just joking, of course. But you've had the distinction of working for Supreme Court justices, leading the Department of Justice, being the top federal prosecutor for the Western District of Pennsylvania. What do you make of this, Harry?
And thanks very much. And I'll just add one thing, not to boast, but because it is relevant here. I clerked for 2 years with Justice Kagan as a clerk, and she authors a blistering dissent that absolutely, is a withering criticism of what the six do. We don't even know who writes among the six. It's just per curiam. This is, by a good margin, the worst Supreme Court opinion that has issued since he's come back to office. Maybe the worst, second only to the immunity case in Trump 1.0. It combines two really problematic aspects of the conservative side of the Supreme Court. The first is their affection, almost fetishistic, for the so-called unitary executive. the notion here, and they kind of grew up loving it, is that you cannot tell the president that he can't fire people for any reason and no reason. There's a very good reason that Congress has said this in many instances, as Kagan, who's the administrative law expert on the court, points out. This serves, you get better people, less partisan people, more it serves professionalism, and it ultimately comes down to better decisions on the ground for the American people. But they've got this notion that it somehow is a outrageous inroad on presidential power, that it really is a unitary executive notion. So that's the first thing. We knew that they had it in its sights, but this is still, by the way, they didn't overrule it. They just basically treated it as if it were dead, and they took it on life support, because this is the second point I want to make. It's their abuse of the emergency docket. So Kagan makes several unanswerable points in dissent, but the first one is this: guys, come on. If you want to overrule this 90-year precedent that is constitutive of the administrative state as we know it, you got to have an argument. You got to have briefs. You got to have the normal way of doing things, not this 2-page elliptical, unexplained kind of ruling that just, it really does do away with Humphrey's executor. She says this is an easy case, and it is an easy case. Humphrey's executor remains good law. This is the NLRB, Ben. It's the very agency that was approved in the For Cause way in the 1935 Humphrey's executor case. It was approved because they have multiple, the power at the top is distributed over several people, and it's really sort of, in one area as opposed to broad executive power. The same thing with the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is the other one up here. So this is, basically, if Humphrey's executor is good law, this can only go one way, and it's the way that the lower courts did. And the Supreme Court has said, including as to itself, don't tell us what's overruled until it's overruled. Apply the damn law. And they just didn't. They just didn't apply. So the combination of these things, the sort of whatever, abstract or political or just, jurisprudential fetish for the unitary executive and this shadow docket and the way of doing things, that makes for a really lousy combo. And then finally, the point you make, it's laughable. So Kagan, after explaining, why do you do the shadow docket? It's such bullshit. And then making the point, as she really is best positioned to make, you're really hurting good government here. Then just says, guys, the Fed, come on. It's just, there's under what they're supposed to do, legal doctrine, there's no way of distinguishing. So, I remember, a case by Chief Justice Rank was, this is a big railroad. It's the same thing. It's a quasi. So what? What under the principle that you've just said that basically takes down Humphrey's executor, protects the Fed? There ain't one. It's just like, holy cow, we can't do this. The economy would go into the toilet. We've got to find some excuse. But that's another way of saying they don't really believe. They don't have the courage of their convictions. I guess you could say it's almost a good thing when it comes to the Fed, because if Trump could just go in and in a tantrum one day, as he's sort of flirted with, 2-3 times since he's been there, just yank power, whoever the head is, we're talking about, probably worldwide economic tailspin and depression. But that is the upshot of what they're saying. And if you don't do the Fed, why? Because this unitary executive principle really shouldn't be as all-encompassing as it is. This is one of the ones that started as a kind of a twinkle in the eye of the Federalist Society, this unitary executive, and now has reached a point that is, basically everything is all gone now. And with the exception of the Fed, and it's so plainly preserving the Fed is so plainly doctrinally hypocritical. So, anyone who wants a little bit more or an example of a killer dissent, they have a 2-page per curiam, don't even say who votes, don't really explore it at all. And then Kagan just mops up the floor with them on 3 separate points. But of course, at the end of the day, here's where things stand. And, it is a foregone conclusion that Humphrey's executor is now a dead letter, even though they haven't overruled it. Let's just start there. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And this is an important enough case that it deserves, a full burial and real consideration if they're doing the right thing, even for posterity. And they just gave it back in the hand.
Whenever I start to see the court use the word quasi, my bullshit detector goes up right away. And then when they use historical tradition and quasi in the same sentence, it's also a way to go, all right, you're trying to just completely, lie to me. And I'll just remind everybody, their historical tradition test is how they've basically ripped away jurisprudence on the Second Amendment and common sense gun control and going, let's look at the historical tradition. And then you'd have a situation where Justice Thomas would write the historical tradition opinion on the Second Amendment. And then people would then try to, would make these arguments. Well, look, there was technically no gun control back in, or gun reform, back in 1785 and 89. And so we should have everything. And then the other justice will be like, whoa. Well, actually, if you look at the historical tradition, they did actually speak about, and then you get into these like weird debates over who's a better basketball player, LeBron James or Michael Jordan. It's just like, it's just like you get into these weird discussions, but like this impacts people's lives. And that's the way they want it, so that they just make up whatever they want the outcome to be and then say, well, that's the historical tradition. And that's like their final. They go through this framework, that framework, this framework. I'm a strict textualist. I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a that. What does history say? Well, I read history as this. I read history as that. All right. Well, y'all are just making a mess of a 2025 society. And a lot of people are being injured because of what you're doing. And it's like, you're too chicken shit to go that far, but the damage you're going to still do is horrible. And now you want like kudos on I didn't do the Federal Reserve. Yeah, but you've basically destroyed every other ability for agencies to be independent. Harry, Talking Feds YouTube, Talking Feds Substack.
Give me I just want to say it was just 5-6 years ago, we had a lot of agencies like this in the country. That good one is the Consumer Finance Protection Board. They're just, so all of these are now, just dead letters, all at the altar of this sort of unitary executive. And and the other point, and this really is cross-cutting for all that Trump's doing, Congress is the one that set up this provision saying you have to fire for cause. Trump simply ignored it, as he's done in so many cases. There's Article 1 there. He just forget about it, ignored it. And so this is another example of what's happening across the board. He's just pretending Congress isn't there. Legislative power is just a little trifle for him. And so that, that they have good reason, and they had good reason for saying we could use some expertise and just some protection. Look, president can always fire people. It's got to have a reason. And the president went, I don't need any reason. And we see what happens when you don't need any reason. You put in, lackeys, people who aren't necessarily any good at all, people who don't have the same kind of lookout for the public welfare. It sounds like a highfalutin, constitutional question. It is, but it really comes down to good government and agency action, and agencies are everywhere in this country. And instead of having people who are there because they're professional and nonpartisan, you have people who are there because of spoil system and they suck up to Trump. That's a really big on the ground difference.
Everybody subscribe to the Talking Feds YouTube, Talking Feds podcast, and Talking Feds Substack. Check it all out. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.